On June 12, 1948, a murder was committed in Coweta County in my home state of Georgia. It has been described as a classic Old South Gothic mystery. It was the basis of several best-selling books and an acclaimed made-for-television movie. It involved the murder of a man named Wilson Turner at the hands of John Wallace, who was portrayed by Andy Griffith in the film Murder in Coweta County, and the relentless pursuit of Wallace by Coweta County Sheriff Lamar Potts, who was portrayed in the film by Johnny Cash. It harkens to a place and time when one criminal could control an entire county. It also marked two rarities in 20th century Georgia history: the execution of one of the wealthiest men to be put to death in the state's history, and one of the few times that a wealthy white man was sentenced to death upon the testimony of African American witnesses. In this episode, we take a look at the crime that inspired the book and movie Murder in Coweta County.
How did John Wallace become such a powerful man in Meriwether County? The answer, he was born into that power. Wallace's mother's maiden name was Strickland, and the Strickland clan ruled Meriwether County for decades with an iron hand. When John Wallace's uncle died, actually he was killed by a GBI agent who later came back to investigate John Wallace's case. That made John Wallace the head of what was called the Strickland Kingdom in Meriwether County.
John Wallace, part of the Strickland clan that had ruled Meriwether County, Georgia for decades, was a wealthy landowner, bootlegger, and farmer. John Wallace inherited the kingdom upon the 1932 death of his uncle John Strickland. John Strickland was killed in a shootout by Georgia Bureau of Investigation agent Elsie Hancock. John Wallace had served time in federal prison for bootlegging in the 1930s, and by 1948 he was determined never to go back to prison. But he was equally determined to keep up his bootlegging operation and his iron grip over the Strickland Kingdom in Meriwether County. Even though Prohibition ended in the 1930s, people in rural Georgia still wanted moonshine. Wilson Turner, a poor white man whose real name was William Turner, talked John Wallace into allowing him to sharecrop on his land. Unbeknown to his wife, William Turner had taken on the name of a relative, Wilson, while avoiding military duties during World War II. Wallace was reluctant at first, as most of his other sharecroppers and bootleg assistants were African American, and therefore, in Wallace's mind, easier to control and intimidate. But Wallace agreed to let Turner sharecrop on his land and hired him to sell some of his moonshine. With a wife and child to feed and another child on the way, Wilson Turner was squeezed for money. He started selling some of Wallace's liquor without permission to make extra money. When Wallace found out, he assaulted Turner, ordered him off his land, and fired him, leaving the destitute father and husband both homeless and jobless. Turner retaliated by stealing two of Wilson's cows and took them to a pasture in neighboring Carrollton, Georgia. Turner was found and arrested by Police Chief Rada Threadgill, but was transferred from the Carrollton jail to the Meriwether County jail in Greenville. Turner begged Chief Threadgill not to allow the transfer, saying that he was certain to be killed in Meriwether County. While in the Meriwether County jail, Turner tried passing notes to people outside his window, asking them to tell his family of his whereabouts, as Sheriff Hardy Collier had not allowed him to make a phone call.
The former Meriwether County jail from which Wilson Turner was let go and led to his death is now a private residence. It's down the street from where I am right now. Behind me is the Meriwether County Courthouse, which is not where John Wallace was tried. He was tried in Coweta County. But a little bit about Wilson Turner's release, or so-called escape, from the local jail here. Turner was led to believe, or at least he believed, that when he was transferred from Carrollton over here to Meriwether County, he was going to be killed while in jail. He was somewhat confused, but also elated when he was allowed to be released on his own. And he was also surprised to see his truck parked not far from the jail. So he gets in his truck, but he realizes right away that most of the gas from his truck has been siphoned out. He remembers having a full tank, or at least a half a tank, but he notices when he cranks the truck that it's sitting on empty. And so he starts to drive away from the Meriwether County Jail, somewhere in this area, and then he stops to get gas, and that's when he notices that John Wallace is on his tail.
The three men with John Wallace were Herring Savell, Henry Mobley, and Wallace's cousin, Tom Strickland. Realizing he had been set up, Turner attempted to escape in his truck, with Wallace and his group in pursuit, 2 men each in 2 cars.
Well, now I'm standing at the place or the area where Wilson Turner was killed by John Wallace. At the time, in 1948, this is called the Sunset Tourist Camp. Now, as you can see, it's a AAA quality upholstery, and it is located just at the city limits, the beginning of the city limits of the town of Moreland in Coweta County. Now, I made the drive from the old Meriwether County Jail, and it was about 15 miles, about 15 minutes, and it was about 4 miles inside the Coweta County line. Some of the customers and the employees of the Sunset Tourist Camp heard and saw the high-speed chase involving John Wallace and Wilson Turner, and either ran out to see what was going on or couldn't help but see what was going on. The proprietor, Steve Smith, left the establishment, as did another employee, and saw John Wallace and his accomplice beating Wilson Turner. And at one point, they asked, if he's an escaped prisoner, why not put the handcuffs on him? Wallace responded something to the effect of, this guy's dangerous, he's wanted for murder, etc., etc. And Wilson Turner, a very small man, fought very hard for his life. At one point, John Wallace raised his shotgun and brought it down so hard on Turner's head that the gun went off. At that point, the witnesses say Turner's body went limp. He was probably dead at that moment, but he was thrown inside the car, and John Wallace continued to pummel and beat Wilson Turner. And then they turned around and headed back toward Meriwether County. Killing people was not new to John Wallace. He had done so several times with impunity and never been prosecuted. The reasons? He had judicial officials in his back pocket, be it judges, prosecutors, Sheriff Hardy Collier. Most potential jurors were either bought and paid for by John Wallace or were afraid of him, and with good reason. And plus, the Meriwether County was populated and dominated by the Strickland clan, of which Wallace was a member. But he made a mistake with the case of Wilson Turner. He and his men siphoned gas from Turner's truck to the point where they thought he could not make it across the county line without running out of gas. They were wrong. Turner crossed the line into Coweta County, and that's when he landed in the jurisdiction of Sheriff Lamar Potts, and that's where Wallace made his big mistake.
Turner's body was first hidden on Wallace's property, then burned in a pit, the ashes and bone fragments scattered in a nearby stream. Wallace forced 2 black field workers, Albert Brooks and Robert Lee Gates, to assist him in destroying the victim's body by burning it and scattering the ashes in a nearby creek. Since witnesses testified that the murder took place in Coweta County, the crime was under the jurisdiction of Lamar Potts, the Coweta County Sheriff. Potts and his deputies searched for days, and then an informant told them that Wallace had burned the body and implicated Brooks and Gates. Potts persuaded Brooks and Gates to take him to the burn site. With the assistance of Elsie Hancock, the same GBI agent who had killed John Wallace's uncle John Strickland, Potts and other officers found bone fragments that the crime lab identified as human. Brooks and Gates also took the sheriff to the well where Turner's body had originally been deposited. Ruptured brain tissue was found that was also identified as coming from a human being. Brooks, Gates, and their families were transferred to a secret location so as to avoid any harm that might come to them from the Strickland clan.
I'm standing now in Newnan, the county seat of Coweta County, in front of what used to be the county courthouse. While the building is still in use, it's no longer the official courthouse for Coweta County. But this is where John Wallace was tried and convicted and sentenced to death. John Wallace's arrogance knew no boundaries. He knew this murder occurred in Coweta County and that he would not have the protection that he had in Meriwether County. Nevertheless, he was not worried. In addition to thinking he had disposed of the body, John Wallace thought he had another ace in the hole. That being the fact that the 2 men who assisted him in burning the body were 2 African-American farmhands, sharecroppers or employees of his, Albert Brooks and Robert Gates. Wallace, in his arrogance, thought that no jury of white people would take the word of an African-American witness against a man like him. He was wrong. John Wallace was a very brutal man. He was also rather intelligent, but he was also very superstitious, and that came into play in this case.
Mahaley Lancaster, a local seer from nearby Heard County, was involved in the case as well, and she would testify against Wallace. Far from the eccentric rube as portrayed by June Carter Cash in the film Murder in Coweta County, Lancaster was an educated woman, a lawyer and political activist, but she was also seen as a seer, and John Wallace relied heavily on her perceived talents and made incriminating statements to her along the way. Wallace's arrogance was his undoing. Being told by Sheriff Collier that Sheriff Potts wanted to talk to him, Wallace actually drove the car in which Turner was killed to the Coweta County Sheriff's Office. Wallace's friends, relatives, and accomplices turned on him to save themselves. Wallace's trial received wide press coverage in the rural community. When offered the chance to testify in his defense, Wallace, against the advice of his lawyer, eagerly volunteered to testify. His arrogance never ceasing, he thought so much of his oratory skills and believed that Coweta County jurors would believe whatever he wanted them to believe. Wallace's bizarre, eccentric 6-hour voluntary testimony led to his conviction. Wallace's accomplices, Henry Mobley, Herring Savell, and Tom Strickland, received life sentences and were released in 1955. Sheriff Hardy Collier was indicted as an accomplice but died before his trial date. Albert Brooks and Robert Gates were freed in exchange for testifying against Wallace. Sheriff Lamar Potts served as sheriff of Coweta County for 32 years before his death in 1971. After several appeals, John Wallace was executed in the electric chair in 1950. His case was unusual because he was one of the richest men ever to be given the death penalty, and his case was the first in Georgia where a white man was given the death sentences upon the testimony of 2 black men.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.